Welcome, everybody. Well, this is the first lecture in the winter lecture series at the Center for South Asian Studies. I'm Will Glover. I'm the director of the Center for South Asian Studies. And it's a real pleasure to have you all here, and a real pleasure to begin our lecture series this semester with one of our own faculty members. Shobita Parthasarathy is a professor of public policy at the Ford School here at the University of Michigan and a professor in the Department of Women's Studies. She's the founder and current director of the Ford School's Science, Technology, and Public Policy program. She started that program, ran it for a while, and then someone else ran it, and now you're running it again. Is that correct? And she's also a very active, valued, and much loved participant as a faculty affiliate in the University of Michigan's multidisciplinary science, technology, and society program. I myself am kind of a member of that, but I don't even know how to pronounce it. Her research is really fundamentally concerned with how technological innovation and innovation systems can better achieve public interest and social justice goals. She looks at the politics of knowledge and expertise in science and technology policy debates. Her academic insights, her research is solidly public-facing. She's written for the New York Times, for Nature magazine, for The Conversation. She's been interviewed by PBS, by The New Scientist. She's been a consultant with American Civil Liberties Union, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the European Patent Office, and she's consulted with individual members of the U.S. Congress as well. So she's very much somebody who's bringing the results of her research out into the public sphere. That's a very characteristic part of her. Professor Parthasarathy's second book, Patent Politics, Life Forms, Markets, and the Public Interest in the United States and Europe, compares recent controversies over life form patents in the United States and Europe. That book won the 2018 Robert Merton Prize given by the American Sociological Association. Her first book, Building Genetic Medicine, Breast Cancer, Technology, and the Comparative Politics of Healthcare, compared the development of genetic testing for breast cancer in the United States and Britain. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that her current research focuses on the politics of technology for the poor, with a particular focus on India. And that's the subject of her talk to us this afternoon. The title of her talk is Understanding the New Credibility Regimes of Development, the Politics of Sanitary Pads as a Pro-Poor Technology in India. Please help me welcome our colleague, Professor Parthasarathy.
Thank you so much, Will. Thanks for such a lovely introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this lecture series. I'm very excited to do so, in part because you're all going to kind of be guinea pigs a little bit. This is, as Will said, a new project for me, and this is an attempt in this talk to kind of synthesize some of my recent findings, and I'm hoping that I can get feedback from all of you on sort of where it is and where hopefully it's going. And it's motivated in part by an interest in what many people see as a new era in international development. And it's a new era in international development along a number of lines. The first is that in contrast to what we might remember as sort of old colonial governments kind of making large infrastructural investments in their colonies, or a later period where we see international NGOs like the World Bank investing in large development projects, today we see a real diversity of the players involved in international development, from social entrepreneurs and innovators to universities like our own, to governments in low and middle income countries, as well as NGOs in those countries as well. And we also see academics playing a large role, and academic journals publishing that work, and media and crowdsourcing also playing a role in kind of putting their thumbs on the scale in terms of what development devices are the ones that we as societies think are the most important, and those that this diverse array of players should be investing in. The second area that's, I think, a little bit different from what we've seen in the past is a real focus on evidence-based policymaking and evidence-based development. We see, you know, as Will said, I'm a professor in a policy school, so I hear a lot of the time discussions about evidence-based policy. But in the international development arena, you see this on in a couple of ways. The first is a real drive towards data. So the most recent Sustainable Development Goals that the UN developed in 2015 has a focus on metrics and indicators and sort of ensuring that data is gathered and also used to drive development decision making. There's also a real focus on impact evaluation and randomized controlled trials as a way to make sure that investments in development are made on an evidence-based, in an evidence-based way. And the third sort of difference that we might see in this new arena is what some anthropologists refer to as little development devices. And so, as I said, you know, in the past, we might think of development in terms of better roads or electrification. Today, we talk about development often as being these magic, simple, small solutions, right? We're talking about clean cook stoves and toilets, sanitary pads, which I'm going to be talking about more today, and other kinds of small solutions that seem to have embedded with them magic, right? That they can have this extraordinary transformative potential in these poorer countries. The question that I have about this is sort of how is this changing landscape shaping development, and what are the consequences of that? And I'm particularly interested in the politics of knowledge around these interventions and sort of two broad sets of questions. The first is a set of questions about how we know what constitutes a good development intervention, right? So what are the knowledge politics that lie underneath these little development devices, our choices of what makes for a good device and what might not make for such a good device, what kinds of evaluations are conducted, and also I have a particular interest not just in the kinds of knowledge that count, but also in the kinds of knowledge that are not generated. What kinds of research questions aren't asked, what kinds of facts are not gathered, and what are the consequences of that? And I'll be talking quite a bit about that dimension today. And I want to suggest that there's a politics broadly that shapes these kinds of choices around knowledge, but also that traditional scientific practices and scientific methods themselves lead us to focus on particular kinds of interventions as opposed to others. And that is related to a large set of literature in science and technology studies, or as Will said, we can't often decide whether we're talking about science and technology studies or science, technology, and society. We'll leave that aside. But there's also a really interesting specific set of literatures in this field that is focused on something called agnotology, which is essentially the study of ignorance. And so I'm interested in that too in the context of development. What are the politics of what we don't know, and how does that figure in these decisions around choices of what technologies have these magic developmental qualities? The second set of questions that I'm interested in is essentially what are the implications of, the normative implications of our seemingly technical choices around what kinds of science matters for development and what kinds of technologies we choose. And in particular, I'm interested here in, and in particular in the sanitary pad case, I'm interested in the consequences for empowerment. So as you'll see, empowerment for girls and women is kicked around quite a bit in this space. And I'm interested in thinking about how particular forms of empowerment are sort of connected to particular forms of what is defined as relevant knowledge and expertise in this field, and how those are connected. And again, what we don't know, the ignorant spaces, you know, how those might actually lead us to different kinds of definitions of empowerment. So as I said, today I'm going to be focusing on menstrual hygiene management, or MHM, and particularly sanitary pads. I've done a little bit of work on toilets and cook stoves. If as I'm talking you have some ideas about other technologies, I'm open to them. I'm just figuring that stuff out now and sort of building the broader project, but this is my first foray into really thinking through what I'm trying to do. just to give you a sense of how I do my work, I'm a qualitative interpretive researcher. I've done quite a number of interviews broadly with social entrepreneurs and innovators, members of the media, academics, development experts, government officials, frontline workers and trainers in the MHM space, for example, with a significant proportion of them focused on the menstrual hygiene space. Then I also do document analysis of civil society documents, government documents, but in these cases, I've also done a systematic analysis of the academic and kind of gray, what you could consider gray literature, which is sort of hybrid literatures that are written for practitioners and policymakers, essentially sort of, that I argue play a central role in constructing the MHM problem and sanitary pads and other technologies as a solution, and I'll talk quite a bit about that today. And then finally, I've done a little bit of participant observation, watching some of the trainings, the MHM education, as well as going to some of the factories where these sanitary pads are made. So I'll start by just kind of stepping back and making into a question something that might seem obvious, which is that today, menstrual hygiene management, or MHM, and sanitary pads seem like an awesome development solution. I'm not going to talk about the Bollywood movie yet, but I'll get there eventually, don't worry. So right today, we tend to see MHM and sanitary pads as being really a key to women and girls' empowerment. In fact, there's Menstrual Hygiene Day that's been created in the last few years. It's May 28th, in case you're interested, 28 days for the 28-day menstrual cycle. But the idea is that one strong argument is that sanitary pads and better MHM more broadly, but really sanitary pads in particular, can help girls stay in school. It will help better MHM can empower girls by getting rid of age-old cultural beliefs and taboos, that a maxi pad can change the world, as you see here, as the social enterprise describes it. And many of my interview respondents really talk about MHM and sanitary pads in particular. They use language like Trojan horse. And what they mean by that is that this is an entree into development and into poor countries, and a focus on poor citizens that can have enormous impacts broadly. And I think you see that well represented in this quote, where as someone from an NGO says, when you're for menstrual equity, it means you're for educational equity, it means you're for workplace equity, it means you're for health equity, right? So again, this sort of romance around these little development devices is often that they have, they're little, simple devices, but they potentially have these enormous transformative consequences. So there's enormous excitement that is evolved around that. And the question is, where did that come from? So if you think not that long ago to 1994, the famous Beijing Conference on Women, where Hillary Clinton talked about how women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, there's no discussion of menstrual health management at all. And in fact, there's no discussion of menstruation or menstrual health management in the context of development for quite a while, until the mid-2000s. And part of that is about academics and development experts being part of the story. And part of it is also about technology and enterprise as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but in part just because I'm going to be going into a lot of detail, I thought that it would be worth kind of foregrounding where I'm trying to go with this project and these ideas that I'm sort of playing with. They're not completely set in stone or figured out yet, but this is what I'm interested in. And what I want to sort of argue in this project is that MHM science, technology, and policy are shaped by a variety of social and political forces. And those social and political forces include, for example, the creation of UN development goals and specific goals around gender equity, education, and what's called WASH, or water, sanitation, and hygiene, that then get used as essentially levers to push an agenda focused on menstrual health. There is famously now a real focus on the girl as the site of intervention in international development efforts, that the girl is sort of pure and has not yet been damaged by culture in some ways, to put it kind of crudely and bluntly, but also that girls can become, if educated properly, and with access to proper technologies can become economic engines. There are also broad market and innovation ideologies at play that shape, that influence a focus on sanitary pads as a solution in particular, and also the idea that new technologies can actually produce new markets, create new producers, new consumers, and then essentially empower these citizens. There are also, you'll see, important stereotypes that persist and that play a role not just in the kind of gray and policy literature, but also in the academic literature in terms of stereotypes about what poor girls in the global South are and what their capacities are. And then there's also, as I mentioned earlier, this drive towards increased scientific evidence and data. And there, I want to expand that a little bit to talk about how the focus on generalizability creates a kind of universalized narrative around MHM as being an international problem that affects girls across the developing world. And in fact, what's interesting is that there are a couple of books by American feminists that you might also call menstrual health activists. They call themselves menstrual health activists, who sort of make the case that this is there's a global problem of shame and concern about stereotypes, and that it's just more extreme in the developing world and among poor girls and women in the global South. These kinds of this sort of scientific method and scientific practices doesn't just focus on generalizability. It also, you can see kind of an emphasis also on discrete interventions. Interventions that can be easily tested through randomized controlled trials, through impact evaluation, and of course, things like sanitary pads are discrete interventions that one can then create clear comparisons to create, for example, a randomized trial. There's also a privileging of knowledge that has been proven through the scientific method, and that at the same time devalues other ways of knowing, including particularly historical, cultural, lay, and indigenous knowledges. And that with this focus, with this sort of construction of particular kinds of knowledges as being those that are the most important in this space, you also see distinct approaches to women's empowerment being, as Sheila Jasanoff argues, co-produced with this. And that there you see empowerment being defined as something essentially that can be created through access to scientific knowledge, access to education, that scientific knowledge is essentially the path to do that, and that is a universal process. So you see language, for example, around fixing the context, that is, that culture can essentially be fixed with standardizable technology and sometimes standardizable education. That empowerment, shame, and dignity have a universal meaning, that there's no variation across cultures. There's also, and this is probably obvious at this point, that there's a real focus on economic empowerment, but the economic empowerment when it comes to girls and women is focused on women as producers and consumers, not necessarily as knowers or innovators. And then, as I said before, girls are understood as the appropriate site of intervention rather than women. So I said that the sort of real focus on menstrual health and hygiene began in the mid-2000s. And in the last few years, what we've seen is an explosion of primarily observational studies, surveys, focus groups, and interviews with students and teachers predominantly in South Asia and in Africa, essentially trying to uncover how girls in these countries manage and think about menstruation. There have been more recently a handful of experimental studies. Those experimental studies, as I suggested already, tend to be testing sanitary pads, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I think it's worth reflecting for a minute on the fact that the vast majority of the literature focuses on girls in schools, studies girls in schools, presumably because girls in schools are more accessible than trying to access women, for example, or other members of a community. They're conducted primarily by public health researchers, and the literature is published in sort of, as I said, in gray spaces, so UNICEF newsletters, for example, but also in a number of prestigious academic journals, for example, the British Medical Journal, the American Journal of Public Health, and there we get back to this point about credibility, the institutions that provide credibility. So we see, for example, major journals essentially saying this is an important issue, we're going to allow for people to publish repeatedly on this issue in these journals. These studies, by and large, identify a number of issues when it comes to the way that girls think about menstruation in these countries. The first is that girls are concerned about poor toilets in their schools. So lack of private toilets, lack of running water, that they're often unclean. Girls talk about feeling discomfort during their periods, that they are concerned about soiling their clothes, especially in the school environment, that there's also a concern expressed by researchers, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. There's a concern expressed by researchers that girls may have poor hygiene that could lead to long-term health problems. There's no evidence of this. What the evidence shows is that girls predominantly use, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as well later, girls predominantly use cloth to manage their menstruation in these countries. And what the researchers tend to do is they will ask girls, how do you manage your menstruation? And these are always studies conducted with poor girls, often rural girls, but usually rural and urban girls. And then girls will say predominantly we use cloth, and then the researchers will say, well, we don't know in these, whether they're washing and drying the cloth properly, and therefore we have these hygiene concerns, and we have these, they may have health effects. Girls don't really know much about menstruation, so we think that there could be these issues, but there's no evidence of those yet. There's also a strong set of questions asked about school attendance, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. There's, as I said, a finding that there's a limited use of disposable sanitary pads, and then finally, as I also said, limited knowledge about menstruation, and that there are a number of girls who observe restrictions based on cultural beliefs. The last three are really the focus of the literature, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about these in turn. But again, I want to sort of call your attention to a couple of things. The first is that, as I already said, MHM is constructed very much as an international problem. So in this literature broadly, you see, the study may take place in Ghana or in India, but the citations are to case studies across developing countries, and the experience of these girls is assumed to be generally similar across these countries. And then the next thing, which I think is really interesting, is that there's only one study that I found that asks girls whether or not they think MHM is a problem. So all of the researchers say MHM is a problem. They assume it to be one. There's only one that asks the girls whether they think MHM is a problem, and the girls kind of say, yeah, no, not really, we have other problems. But that doesn't affect the fact that the researchers still talk about how MHM is a problem. So the first, and frankly, the strongest, the largest set of literature focuses on the link, the purported link between menstrual hygiene management and school attendance. That's really the dominant framing that we see in the academic literature, and that is then reflected in policy literature among practitioners, among social entrepreneurs, et cetera. And the concern is twofold. Either that girls are missing days of school during the year because of their menstrual cycle, and that they are dropping out of school entirely due to menstruation. There, as I suggested, are dozens of academic studies on this topic. I think, again, because they're accessing girls in schools. One of the reasons is that they're accessing girls in schools, and so at the same time they're getting access to school records, and they're trying to make this link. But by and large, there's pretty limited evidence of a clear problem. But the studies keep getting repeated over and over again. There is stronger evidence that girls drop out around puberty, but the link to menstruation you often see inferred in these discussions, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. Also, you see links often exaggerated in the literature. So, for example, one study talks about how 50%, their conclusion is 50% of girls miss school due to menstruation. It turns out that the question that was asked is, have you ever missed school, a day of school, due to menstruation? Right? So but the slippages are easy, I would argue, because there's a focus on showing that MHM is a problem and it's linked to school attendance. There's also, we see real credulity in showing evidence, in evidence that either doesn't exist or says something else. And perhaps the clearest example of that is this UNICEF 2005 citation that I have a couple of research assistants in the room who spent many, many hours trying to figure out what they're talking about when they cite this, and this is a citation that you see over and over again. This is one of a few of them in this MHM space. And essentially, UNICEF 2005 citation goes to a UNICEF website that is focused on data. So what we can surmise from that is that there may have been some data there that talks about school attendance, but we can't even figure out that it talks about puberty in school attendance. And yet, it keeps getting cited over and over again. Or the original study that cites it, that's written by a major advocate in this area, a professor at Columbia, gets cited multiple times. There are also sort of the other strategy, so over time, the studies sort of say, yeah, we recognize that it's not clear, but clearly there must be a problem. And so then there's a group of scholars in the UK who says, okay, well, we can't establish that there's a problem, but maybe if we do a randomized controlled trial with sanitary pads, that'll affect school attendance. And they don't really find that it makes a difference. Their argument, however, is that it makes a tiny difference, and this is an emergency situation, so we should ensure that sanitary pads are made available to girls to address school attendance. So there is, however, one thing that I think that a menstrual health educator based in South India mentioned that I think is at least worth noting when thinking about ignorances, which is that it turns out that at least in India, poor boys are also dropping out at similar rates to girls. And so this menstrual health educator by the name of Sinu Joseph asked cheekily whether they should be offered sanitary pads as well. So, as I said, it's not, this is, and I think that this is really important because those of us who think about the politics of science quite a bit are often confronted with the argument that the scientists are doing wonderful work and it's the policy arena that distorts that. And so I think showing how the scientific work itself leads us to certain kinds of solutions is important. But here we see a couple of perspectives from the kind of practitioner world. And I've included the first quote, which says, one major concern is the impact of cultural practices and lack of services for menstrual hygiene management on girls' access to education. A study in South India reported that half the girls attending school were withdrawn by their parents once they reached menarche, mostly to be married. This was either because menstruation was regarded as a sign of readiness for marriage, or because of the shame and danger associated with being an unmarried pubescent girl. So the problem here, of course, is that the study is about puberty and girls dropping out at puberty, and that's actually what the citation, this Caldwell-Reddy and Caldwell citation suggests, although there's a question about how they're getting that data, but that's what the study suggests. But the concluding sentence at the beginning is about lack of services for menstrual hygiene management, right? That's the conclusion that's drawn. And then the second, that comes from WaterAid India, which is a major NGO. The second comes from Dasra, which is a social innovation incubator / NGO based in Mumbai and funded by US Agency for International Development and another philanthropic organization, produced in 2015 a report focused on MHM. And they have a number of statistics in there, and I will talk about them a little bit more in a minute. But they cite these statistics about girls being absent 20% of the year during menstruation and 23% of girls dropping out of school due to lack of functioning toilets. There's no citation in the report. What I deduce is that those citations come from an A.C. Nielsen study This A.C. Nielsen study is cited all over the place when it comes to MHM in India, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what's interesting is that this is the other thing that my research assistants have looked long and hard for and never found, which is the actual study. It's not just me. There's a medical anthropologist based at UMass Boston who wrote a book that was published in the fall, who talks about how she too sort of went on a quest to try to find this A.C. Nielsen study, and the best she could find was a slide deck that reported the results. The problem, of course, is we have no idea who was asked, what they were asked, but these statistics have taken on a life of their own in a world where statistics are so important in the context of international development to motivate so many interventions in this space. And these kinds of perspectives are repeated, as I suggested, widely in the national and international media. So I talked about a little bit about sort of the economic dimensions of this, but that's really, sort of the question of why it is that it's so consequential to establish a link between MHM and school attendance. The answer is that fits within this trope of focusing on the girl as potentially providing economic power, right, in these developing countries. And you see this both at the individual level, that the individual girl can become self-actualize, become a part of the economy, but also at the national level, right? So another quote from that Dasara report talks about how, keeping girls in school can add $100 billion to India's GDP over their lifetimes. And then also talks about a triple return on investment, and how this also has, and a colleague pointed out to me, especially for those of you who know about the kind of politics of population control throughout the 20th century, there's also a strong dimension of that happening here, that girls, if they are more educated, then we will have reduced population. And of course, that's good the argument is within the Indian context, that's good for us because we can have a better, stronger economy. So now I want to turn to the second focus, which I've kind of been foreshadowing a little bit already, which is that the problem is that girls don't have access to sanitary pads, and that, therefore, disposable sanitary pads are an appropriate solution. So as I mentioned already, girls have multiple material concerns, but their primary concern when it comes to school is that the toilets are pretty insufficient and yucky, essentially. But, right, in some, that there's poor infrastructure. But the studies and the discussion, the policy discussion, as well as the kind of social entrepreneurship around this, focuses not on those issues, and not even, many of you may know that India has, for the last few years, been involved in a Clean India or Swachh Bharat campaign. The Swachh Bharat campaign, in some places there are discussions about menstruation, but it hasn't risen, that's not a central part of that campaign. That's about, numbers of toilets, essentially. So the studies focus on the promise that sanitary pads provide, and in particular, the promise that disposable sanitary pads provide. And as I suggested already, that comes from this assumption that girls do not know how to manage the cloth that they're using to manage their menstruation, that they're not washing and drying it properly, that they can't possibly know because these are practices that are shrouded in these cultural beliefs, so the girls are embarrassed to dry the cloths in public, so there must be poor hygiene that can eventually lead to poor health impacts. So the assumption is that this is an unsafe practice, and that the safe practice then is the use of the disposable pad. And there are varying numbers in terms of what percentage of girls, and again, these are studies usually of poor girls, mostly rural girls, what percentage of them actually use cloth versus disposable. It varies quite significantly, so I'm not going to get into that. But A.C. Nielsen, our friends at A.C. Nielsen, come back into the story here, and this is where they really pack their punch, which is that their study shows apparently that only 12% of women in India use disposable sanitary pads. And again, if you were to Google that, you would be busy for the rest of the weekend because it's endlessly cited, this statistic. And what is then also reported, you could cite the other piece too, or you could Google the other piece too, which is that over 88% of women use shocking alternatives like rags, ashes, and husk sand, wood pulp, and dry leaves. You see sort of variations on that, but always it's shocking alternatives. That's the quote that you see, and then you see use of rags, and that kind of language sounds shocking, and it sounds like the kinds of things you would hear in the media, but you see very similar kinds of language in the academic literature as well. And I just want to, I'll talk about this more in a second, but rags, of course, is a normative term, right? You could talk about old cloth. You could even, it's 2019, you could say recycled cloth, for example. That might give you a different image of what's happening. But use of rags sends us into a different kind of conversation, and that is usually how it's described in these contexts. By contrast, both academic researchers and practitioners talk about how sanitary pads are, disposable sanitary pads in particular, are fast, simple, and clean. They can be used to address this urgent situation of menstrual hygiene management. And of course, they are easier to study, as I suggested already, with state-of-the-art methods like randomized control trials. At the same time, though, it is again worth thinking about not just the normative dimensions of how this conversation is taking place, but what are the research questions and facts that are left unexplored or uncreated. The first is about the environmental implications of disposable pads. Some people in India are starting to think about those kinds of issues. There's, as far as I can tell, really one academic article that I could find that talks about the environmental implications of disposable pads in a country that has, sort of issues, let's say, with its sanitation. This is a concern, but it rarely makes its way into the public conversation. The other thing, though, that is not that question is starting to come up. The question that's not starting to come up is why women use cloth or other materials in the first place. How did they come to use that? What kind of innovation was involved? How does it fit within particular context? In what ways does it work for women and for girls? In other words, historical and anthropological questions, but also questions that get to the heart of how we think about innovation. And just as an aside, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So, this is the world that's emerging. Over the last 10 years or so, we see other kinds of institutions get involved in this to essentially certify the importance of sanitary pads as the perfect solution. So World Bank, Clinton, and Gates Foundations are funding sanitary pad innovation efforts. The Indian government creates a subsidized sanitary pad scheme for rural adolescent girls. And at the same time that that's happening, often what motivates that are the kinds of problematic or shocking statistics like those from the AC Nielsen study. This is an example from the T Foundation, which has created a sanitary pad donation bank in India. And I should just say, as an aside, that these are equally kind of efforts that are happening outside of India as well as efforts that are happening inside of India. So I don't want to suggest that it's sort of outsiders that are coming in. That's part of what the interesting story here is in terms of, I think, the diversity of participants in constructing these solutions and this kind of science around these solutions. So here they've rounded up and they talk about how only 15% of women in India have access to sanitary pads. I don't think they're reaching from a different study, because here on another part of their website, they use the 23% of girls dropping out of school statistic as well. So clearly they're also getting it from the AC Nielsen statistics, but that's part of what allows them to have credibility in creating the sanitary pad bank, right? And then, of course, no talk about sanitary pads or menstrual hygiene management these days would be complete without talking about Padman. And for those of you who have heard about Padman before, I think it's worth spending at least a minute or two thinking about why it is you've heard of Padman. And Padman's given name is Arunachalam Muruganantham. He's from South India. He's from a town in South India, and he's a man who essentially got married and then discovered that women menstruate, and that it's actually true, No comment. And he also discovered that sanitary pads, disposable sanitary pads, are really expensive. And so he said, okay, I'm going to set out to create a low-cost sanitary pad. And he was already a bit of a tinkerer. He dropped out of formal education at the age of 14, but he was, sort of interested in tinkering like this. And so he developed not just a low-cost sanitary pad, but machinery for making those sanitary pads. Now, I just want to say, and I'll come back to this in a second, that one of Muruganatham's discoveries was that cotton wool, for example, wasn't absorbent enough. You know what was? Cellulose. And I'll just remind you that A.C. Nielsen was talking about how wood pulp was a shocking alternative in terms of what women use. And it turns out, by the way, that ash, things like ash, are also pretty absorbent. So hey, maybe women know something. Anyway, so he creates the sanitary pad making machine. He creates a social enterprise that essentially involves selling these sanitary pad making machines to women's self-help groups throughout India. And women's self-help groups have a history in microfinance and the work of the Grameen Bank. But these self-help groups are essentially designed across India. They've really taken off. The idea is that they can create little enterprises and then ensure that women can be both producers and consumers, right? And so he is helping essentially to make that happen. And there are issues around quality and controversies around little controversies, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to talk about in the questions if they're interesting to you. But as for those of you who've heard of Padman know, his story has garnered enormous national and international attention. And he has, speaking of institutions of credibility, they range from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, giving him an award, to him receiving the Padma Shri, the fourth highest civilian honor in India, to being on a panel with Bill Gates and the head of the NIH, giving a well-received TED Talk, being profiled by the New York Times, the BBC, the Bollywood movie that came out about a year ago. There's actually an Oscar-nominated short film that's up for an Oscar this year called Period, End of Sentence, that is about essentially Muruganathan. So he has gotten enormous attention. But it, I think, behooves us, not the Muruganathan story in particular because it's garnered this attention, but more broadly, the idea of the sanitary pad solution, I think, should lead us to reflect for a moment about what's the construction of empowerment here, right? And so here you see, again, a construction of empowerment focused on economics, but a distinct kind of economics. That is, that women here are producers and consumers, and they are given the opportunity to have self-determination and dignity, but it also erases women as innovators and knowers in this space around MHM or around sanitary pads, right? So any kind of historical innovation, sort of the development, it's as though there was nothing and now there's something, right? That's the kind of way that all of this discussion occurs, right? And any kind of, anything that other alternatives have no history in and of themselves, they're defined as shocking. And in fact, today there are there's the Self-Employed Women's Association based in North India that has also produced sanitary pads because they don't think much of Muruganatham's version, and they've also created a distribution system around them. But there's no Bollywood movie about them. They haven't won any awards to my knowledge either. And interestingly, in interviewing them, they don't talk about what they do in the language of innovation. Whereas Muruganatham's innovation fits within what we understand to be innovation. His technology, he's received a patent. He fits within our stereotype of the lone genius, intrepid inventor, right? And he's producing a scalable technology. And so the third and final piece of this story, the sort of major focus, is on the discovery of the problem of taboos and ignorance. So these academic studies, as well as I said, the sort of NGO infrastructure that's emerged, tend to pathologize adolescent girls as having poor, incorrect, or inadequate knowledge about menstruation and health and hygiene, but as I've said multiple times, there's no evidence that that's created health problems, but there's assumption that it will, so they need to be properly educated. And they note repeatedly that girls get information about menstruation from their mothers, and that's a shame because their mothers don't really know. And so, but mothers can't be the points of intervention. Girls need to be the points of intervention because they can actually be convinced. And you see that kind of normative language here in this academic piece that talks about how it's alarming that only about 1 in 8 of the participating girls knew correctly that the menstrual blood came from the uterus, and 187 stated that menstrual bleeding is nothing but disposal of waste blood in the body, right? So how can they be so ignorant is essentially, and what are the problematic consequences? The second major theme is that these girls are constrained by problematic cultural beliefs, myths, and taboos. And those are usually talked about as being pretty universal. So they say, in all of these countries, in all of these places, there are these restrictions. And in the Indian context, they talk about how Indian girls and women observe restrictions during menstruation, like being restricted from religious practices, eating particular foods, or taking medicine, wearing new clothes, applying makeup, attending to guests, etc. What's interesting to me about this is, again, the sort of similar case as in the focus on the kind of means or technologies with which girls and women manage their menstruation. It's that there are no questions about where those beliefs come from, right, or how they're situated, or why they exist, or whether or not they're tied to indigenous knowledge systems, for example, things like Ayurveda or other indigenous knowledge systems, which is particularly strange given a moment in time where indigenous knowledge and things like Ayurveda, especially in the Indian context, are being valued around the world. In fact, in India itself, there is the construction of the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library that is designed to codify traditional knowledge. Why? Because there are concerns that that knowledge is being patented because other people find it incredibly valuable, right? But that's not seen as, it's not, there's no discussion of it. So it doesn't exist in this literature, right? These are beliefs, so there's no facticity to that kind of knowledge. But the argument is essentially that formal MHM education, and in particular scientific knowledge, can address these problems, that they can combat myths, and they can also address problems with health and hygiene. And that is tied to ensuring that girls will be more confident and, again, be able to self-actualize. These trainings usually take place in schools. There's a mix of academics and NGOs involved, and sometimes social entrepreneurs as well. There's a variety of really creative efforts like role plays and active learning in order to offer this. Here's an example of an MHM curriculum that's offered by Wash United, which is an NGO based in Germany but has a strong presence in India, and they have developed a curriculum that essentially has been scaled around the country. So interesting, one of the things I've been thinking about is how this training also is universalizing. It's also a scalable technology. It's also defined as kind of this objective thing that sort of the technology plus the education can be brought into a context, and it can literally, as the World Bank Development Marketplace, which focuses on encouraging these little development devices, talks about, it can literally fix the context. That's how, these sort of objective interventions are being defined. So then it's worth reflecting finally on how empowerment gets defined in these contexts and what the meaning of that is. So that, I think, is encapsulated well by this quote from Ecofem, which actually produces cloth pads. They essentially create kind of pretty cloth pads with lovely patterns, et cetera. And they envision a transformed world in which girls and women are honored and dignified, free from shame and oppression, equipped with the knowledge, resources, and skills to live in harmony with their bodies, free to participate fully in their lives, globally connected and supported, and empowered to care for Earth. They are interested in cloth pads in part because of the environmental concerns that they have. But they're also envisioning a kind of universal understanding of empowerment, a universal understanding of the path to achieving that empowerment. And they are talking about this in the context of the trainings that they provide, which they require girls to undergo these trainings if they in order to get access to their cloth pads. So they're saying basically this kind of knowledge that with our pads can then help to create this transformed world where empowerment, shame is gone. Girls have dignity, but those are also defined in kind of universalized ways. What's interesting, again, is to think about how, what are the knowledges that are left out of this, and what kinds of empowerment might we envision if we took those knowledges seriously. And there are a couple that I can think about that I've just sort of been brainstorming around. And the first is that, there are cultural beliefs that also might be understood as being positive when it comes to empowerment. There are, in parts of India, for example, puberty rituals when a girl achieves menstruation. There are also, there is a literature that I've been going through now that talks about how Ayurveda has particular prescriptions around menstruation, particular why there are certain food restrictions, for example. As I said already, the sort of fact that we're not thinking about that stuff is a little bit odd, given the renewed interest in traditional knowledge. But it's interesting to think about what if we took that kind of knowledge seriously, what kinds of theories of empowerment might result from that, right? So thinking about, okay, maybe our ancestors have some knowledge. Might pride in that, or knowledge of that, or understanding of that create different kinds of avenues for empowerment, and different kinds of power that may not look like power, for example, in the United States, but are power nonetheless. And also, I think it's interesting to think about, and I certainly don't have any answers, about where this could fit into MHM education. So then, just to conclude, I've already sort of given you a sense of how I'm trying to think about this, but what I'm trying to do is to, there are some scholars who have talked about how politics shapes development interventions. I mean, that's not new to talk about, really. But what I'm interested in is thinking also about how the politics of knowledge around international development exists, and what kinds of political ideologies and cultures shape that. And also how assumptions that are embedded in scientific practices and the scientific method actually produce certain kinds of interventions and certain kinds of ideas, certain kinds of normative ideas about what constitutes a good intervention, but also what constitutes a good girl, what constitutes innovation, what constitutes the innovator, and what constitutes empowerment. And so those are, I think, the important things to think about, that the implications of us relying on certain forms of knowledge and not other kinds of knowledge, not asking other kinds of questions or uncovering certain kinds of facts, is that it has a particular implication for how we think about empowerment. And that if we were to think about empowerment differently, that might lead us down different kinds of roads in terms of how we think about international development more broadly. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Hold on a second, sir.
Oh.
Can we record?
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious right now about Padman, because it was sort of, what were the effects of, I guess, his products and his manufacturing? Because he has so much influence through Bollywood movies and got so many awards. So how come the percentage is still so low, just 15%, or is that a significant increase from before?
So that's an old well, we don't know much about that statistic, as I said. That A.C. Nielsen study, in theory, occurred in 2010. So we don't know. There are scholars who argue, and also NGOs, who talk about how actually there has been an increase in the use of disposable sanitary pads. But there's an accompanying concern about the increase in use of disposable sanitary pads, but because there's a serious concern about disposal. How and where are these girls disposing it? The other complication here is that what this Padman story has done, and the focus on disposable sanitary pads more generally, has made, apparently, and this is sort of, I haven't seen this in a study, this is just from the data that I've gotten from interviews, that girls are now, rural girls and poorer girls are saying, we want disposable sanitary pads. So that's become something they want because they see this in a Bollywood movie, they see this as a sign of modernity, whether or not it's appropriate, whether or not it's going to benefit them, whether or not there are environmental implications. And just on the Padman point, I think this is actually, also tells us something interesting, which is, I mentioned, so first of all, there are concerns about the quality of the pads that are produced by these machines, but actually, interestingly, more problematically, I think, is that, so he has distributed these machines, but he's the only person who can service the machines. And he's not, and they break down, apparently frequently. And so, but he's not going, he can't go to all these places, and often they can't afford to have him come to these places. So now there are a whole lot of sanitary pad making machines lying vacant all over the country. It's not unlike toilets, actually. And that's really interesting, right? Because that's one of the costs, I think, of development that we don't often talk about, is that there's all of this excitement. It gets blown up by this media attention, and then it creates kind of perverse incentives and also kind of material effects that we don't necessarily think about. Yeah.
There was first the
Oh, sorry. Yeah, he has the mic. So.
You quoted a statistic of 50% approximately of young girls miss a day of school due to menstrual management. What is the statistic for the United States? Yeah,
that's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, I would be in the 50%. So, I think that's what's interesting to me about the pathologizing that happens in this literature, is I keep reading this stuff and being like, why is this a problem? Like, okay, yeah, girls, right? So one of the shocking statistics is that girls don't know about their periods until they get their periods. And I'm like, okay, maybe it should be different, but why is that a problem that reaches this level of attention? And I think that it goes to all of these political factors that are happening, and that are happening around it, and this focus on the girl in particular as a potential engine that gives it this outsized attention. And it's interesting. That's partially why I want to look at other technological interventions, because when I kind of got stunned by this. I'm not sure that when I went into this project, I thought that this was going to be what I was focusing on, but I kind of couldn't. I just was totally puzzled by the fact that this has taken over in this way, and that's why I want to look at other technologies to understand how the kind of politics of knowledge around that compares, to see if we can get a bigger theoretical understanding that might be useful for development experts and institutions as a means of thinking about this in a systematic way to avoid, kind of, as I was saying, kind of some of the negative material effects.
So I have a follow-up question to that, because that was one of my questions. In the literature, has there been any push for like the why cause to why girls are missing school? Not just, oh, they might be on their period, but like, is it the impact of poverty on paying school fees? Is it family conditions? Is it like there's chronic pain that generally and globally goes ignored or becomes ignored or is ignored by medical professionals? And then my actual question is something different, but I'm just curious if you saw any probing in the studies you've looked at so far.
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, what's interesting is, so you're getting at one thing, just a small part of that that's even, like you could say, okay, I get that you're like really focused on this MHM question. How do you know that the problem is lack of access to a sanitary pad? How do you know that the problem isn't ibuprofen access, right? For example. That is not something, that doesn't get interrogated, and I don't, and that's what made me start thinking about, the kinds of analysis that's being done, and sort of, okay, we can access the school, We can do certain kinds of analysis in the school. We can't do an ethnography, so we can't ask that kind of question because we then, maybe we can't get that kind of answer, right? So but I also think it's just about, this is a simple solution, but it is strange to me. Maybe it also goes to, well, we don't want to be seen as pushing ibuprofen, but then like, why does sanitary pads get seen as benign and ibuprofen is seen as problematic, for example, right? So yeah, I think that's the other dimension of this, right? Like, why are there are so many questions, and there have been lots of articles, but the articles are kind of focused on a pretty narrow subset of questions.
And then my other bigger question is, does the capped capital access for nonprofits and like nonprofit interventions kind of incentivize public health researchers or other social science researchers to push like those linkages harder for visibility?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. But I mean, what's interesting now, this medical anthropologist by the name of Chris Bobel that I mentioned wrote this book in the fall, and she, describes herself as a feminist and menstrual health activist, but she's also trying to be critical. And a lot of these organizations are now saying, wait a second, we created a monster. All of a sudden, all of the focus is on sanitary pads. It should be on these other things, but they know that they can't. They realize that it's very hard to get other things. For them, other things is not like thinking about indigenous knowledge systems. It's MHM education. But they say the problem is that everybody wants to fund products, right? So that's the problem, right? And I say, okay, that's the problem, but that's like that's part of a bigger set of politics and problems that you're not, that you're not seeing. Yeah, John.
Thank you, Shobita. This is really great. Of course, I've gotten to hear this first time, so it's really great to see how it's developing. I was thinking about it and wondering, and maybe it's just a redescription, that using the kind of Latourian language of reduction and amplification. I mean, there's a sense in which, right, reducing complex problems to simple solutions and then amplifying them out. I mean, it seems to me the question then is, how do so many people get sucked into that? And people who might have vested interest in other approaches either get pushed aside or decide that their future, lies in going with this one way of doing things, right? And then turning it into something which, as you say, feeds on itself and becomes very hard to stop as it grows and as it gets more and more precise on this is one simple thing, and especially the more complex social problems, whether it's the infrastructure of toilets and waste removal or public health, right? I mean, even knowing things like are boys out as often as girls, which would, of course, undercut much of the thing. So I'm wondering whether you've thought about whether some of the analytics could really be taken completely away from where Latour ever thought about them, but then reused here to think about the kind of crowding out and absorption that seems to be at the heart of the story and is often the heart of many techno-innovative solutions to complex social problems.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I've been thinking a lot about it. But again, that's, I think, why I want to look across technologies, because I think that's what's really going to give me the analytic leverage. What's interesting to me about this in this context is that there is one woman in Bangalore who, by the name of Sinu Joseph, who writes prolifically. And what's interesting about her is that a couple of things are interesting about her. The first is that she is a menstrual health educator. She was going around as part of some of these initiatives to educate girls, and girls were asking her questions like, girls would, so this is what she said. She said, girls would say things like, my parents are starving me during my period. And she said to me, and this goes, by the way, to the data collection, right? Because she was like, yeah, so you can see that being reflected in the data collection, right? So, but Sinu was like, she probed that, right? And it turns out that the parents were not starving this girl, but that the parents were saying you should eat X and not A, B, and C, or X and Y and not A, B, and C. And so, she had many of these kinds of interactions, and she said, okay, I need to figure out why this is happening. And what's interesting, particularly about her, is that she is Christian. So she did not experience this herself and didn't have any kind of frame of reference for it. So she started looking, and she was like, oh, wait a second. Some of this seems to be tied to Ayurvedic medicine. Some of this, So she has been trying to write this stuff and talk about it, but it's as though it's happening in a different space. So too is the academic literature. And the other way I've been trying to think about it is, there is an academic literature. I've found, sort of 15 to 20 articles about Ayurveda and menstruation. None of it is cited by the public health MHM literature or academic literature or discussed in any of that other stuff. Which even from the perspective of you want these kinds of interventions to be taken up, so maybe you should have a sense of where these beliefs come from, just from a pragmatic perspective, there's no relationship. But Sina Joseph does occasionally get interviewed, but her ideas, she gets sort of put on a panel as the contrary voice and kind of caricatured in that way, right? Because she's not saying, nobody should use sanitary, it's not a sort of outlandish suggestion. She's just saying there's a lot of indigenous knowledge here. You're kind of mapping Western ideas of empowerment onto this context. There's also these problematic connections to commodification, but those things aren't getting taken up. So if you just look at this case, what you see is that it's remarkable that there's not more controversy, and that the one voice that's sort of trying to be contrarian, and then the kind of other, the academic literature kind of gets, crowded out in your language. The other thing I'll just mention, nobody's asked about it yet, and I don't know if you're getting there, but there's been this recent controversy that I, by no means, have figured out around the Sabarimala temple in South India. And the Sabarimala temple has historically banned women of menstruating age from entering the temple. The Indian Supreme Court recently said, this is a secular society, no way, that's not happening. And so women have entered the temple. This has caused massive consternation, protests on both sides, et cetera, right? What's interesting to me is that debate is being framed in terms of sort of modernity, tradition and modernity, gender equality, and there's something that, as I said, I haven't completely figured it out, but there's something that's interesting to me about how it's kind of mapping onto Western, it's an attempt to map onto Western debates instead of, thinking about, okay, maybe, we need to think about sort of Indian empowerment or gender equality in India in a different kind of way. Instead, it's kind of, and I see that in this case too, which is that it's sort of mapping directly onto the way that the Western world and international development thinks about these issues, and Indians are doing that too, and they're not saying, wait a second, maybe there's an entirely different normative environment here, and we need to think differently about it. You see it occasionally, right, in this puberty ritual. There's also a discussion in Bangalore about giving women menstrual leave, right? So there are these moments where you say, hey, wait a second, that would never happen in the United States, and it's not like this cultural taboos and myths. So that's like a hook into a different way of thinking about the normative dimensions of this, but the kind of dominant Western approach seems to, at least in this case, be quite oppressive, let's say.
This is a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. One of the things that this case points to is this broader problem of how academic research from low-income countries is limited around things like this. And as researchers or as development practitioners or researchers, we're reliant on studies like the A.C. Nielsen study. And if I'm writing a grant to USAID, I'm going to be citing that study as well around MHM because that's the most widely framed literature around this. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice for people who are 2 degrees removed and are trying to work off of knowledge, because as an information scientist, I'm developing a product around MHM, working off of knowledge that exists out there. And this is a broader problem in science where A, academic literature is weak or not found, and B, the gray literature gets cited by UN agencies, the World Bank, et cetera, and we're reliant on that kind of information.
That's a great question, and I appreciate as a practitioner that you're asking it. I think that's really important. What's interesting in this case is actually there are quite a bit of Indian scholars publishing this academic literature. It doesn't get cited as much by the others, but it does get cited. So I don't want to suggest that there aren't Indians in this space. I think that they are, and this is where I think even within India there's a divide between the sort of vision of India that middle class and upper middle class Indians and urban Indians see, and the India that poor girls and women and rural girls and women experience. And so that's where I think, some of these fundamental questions about sort of what are the priorities of these girls and women? Do they think that menstrual health is something that they're concerned about? How do they use these technologies, in their everyday life? And, sort of those kinds of broad, open-ended, maybe more participatory kinds of questions, I think are really important as a baseline. What's interesting is that in a lot of the literature, especially the sort of the major American scholar in this field, Marnie Summer, who's based at Columbia, she often talks about how we need to do more research about how girls are going to use this because girls are the best knowers, right? And I always think it's strange when I've read a lot of her work now, and I think, well, that's weird. I mean, yes, girls are. So, but why didn't you ask them whether they care about MHM? Right? So I think, and this is true of me too as an expert, right? Which is that, we as experts have to think about to what extent our scientific interests are shaped by our scientific priorities or our social position. Okay, so let's actually think about girls as knowers and in fact knowers in terms of what their priorities are, right? And there are strategies to kind of do that participatory work. And that's one of the questions that I've had and I'm trying to figure out. Is that actually I think that there are initiatives in international development to kind of increase participation of the communities that are sort of in question into setting development priorities. So then why are they not a part of this discussion? And frankly, I think that's true to what I know, from what I know of the toilet conversation as well as the cook stove conversation. They're not part of that either. So what's the disconnect? Are these happening in completely different buildings in the World Bank kind of complex? Why are those kinds of things not happening together?
Hi. Great talk, and I think this might be some sort of a segue from the last question. We know that data leads to action vis-a-vis policy at times, and there's all this problematic data out there, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the policies as they exist in this space right now, whether local or otherwise.
Yeah, so official policies are this sanitary pad, subsidized sanitary pad scheme that the Indian government has. The Kenyan government also has something similar, actually. To my knowledge, those are the only two national governments that have something. In India, there are also a number of state-based, state-level initiatives. There are also guidelines that the Indian government has developed around MHM that are more detailed, that are sort of essentially national, so it's not just about rural girls, it's girls across the country. But the policy, for example, so I talked to a woman in Tamil Nadu, in the Tamil Nadu government, which is one of the states in South India, and she said, and I asked her, we were talking, she was saying, we've offered for many years, before the national policy, we offered all girls disposable sanitary pads. And I was like, and how do you manage disposal? And she said, we have no problem with disposal, we have incinerators. Which, for those of you who know, incinerating these disposable sanitary pads is problematic because it releases toxic fumes. So that's essentially the policy environment. There's also, if you think more broadly about policy, there have been among philanthropic foundations, and World Bank, a number of, through their innovation offices or schemes, efforts to fund sanitary pads sanitary pad innovation in particular. So I would also include that. So that's sort of where the priority setting also happens, I think.
Do I have the mic? Thanks, Shobita. I really enjoyed hearing this, and I think your points were amazingly well taken and well argued. So in terms of this is a work in progress, it's coming through really clearly. But I'm left with two questions, which have mostly to do with my lack of knowledge about this area. So the first is that in presenting the earlier part of the paper and showing us the kind of knowledge production, your own, I think, perspective on the problems of the very problematic nature of that knowledge production came through loud and clear. What was less clear to me was, is there an MHM, is that a management, is there a quote unquote problem on the ground in India, right? Like that actually was, I was kind of left saying like, okay, we've got all of this problematic statistics and we have this internationally created, fabricated kind of problem, but given your conversations with activists and NGOs and people who are actually working on the ground, this knowledge that you're talking about, like if we were going to these girls themselves, can you tell us anything about how you might now, based on this knowledge, identify what the problems actually are, right? And obviously the corollary to that is, does the disposable sanitary pad address those issues in any kind of way? The second question is about what you told us about how this is a very contemporary discourse, the MHM, how it's really kind of, it's sprung up. And I guess I was wondering if you could share any insights that you have. I mean, you pointed to the shift in identifying the girl as this new site of promise, but could you tell us anything more about what your own insights are about where this is coming from? I'm particularly interested in the connection. It was in one of your early slides where you talked about the market, right, as this kind of new form of development, and how much of this discourse can we kind of find our way back to this as a commodity and an opening market. I mean, it's not lost on me that this becomes an international thing about the time that India's market, right, is also opening up and transformations in its economy. How much impetus would you put on the market as informing this development problematic?
Right. Brilliant questions. So I'll answer the answer to the first one is difficult because of course I don't like to answer those questions, but I think it's important to think about them and answer them. I mean, my instinct, the easy out is to say I don't know if there's a problem because the knowledge about the problem is refracted through this literature and always partial. But I want to take what you're asking seriously. I mean, I think the first thing I would do is to find out whether this is a problem for girls. I don't think we actually know the answer to that question. So the first is a research question, a purely research question. I do think that it's clear that girls don't know about menstrual health. I think that they are they are presented with all of these restrictions when they reach puberty and they don't know what's going on and they don't know why, and it is on its face very disempowering to them, right? Or to use contemporary language, right? I don't know if I necessarily want to adopt it completely, but so I would say, there is a need for some kind of discussion. Who is involved in that discussion and how that discussion takes place, I think, is the question. So I think, and this is the sort of second area I would say where there needs to be more research. That is, I'm not against scientific, girls knowing about their biology, but I also think that simply being told, you're being asked to observe these restrictions, those restrictions are based in myths, they're wrong, you should make your own decision about whether you want to follow them, is partial and unrealistic given the context. And so sort of thinking in a more strategic way about where do these things come from, why do we have them, how can we incorporate that into educational initiatives, I think is something that is a missed opportunity and deeply problematic even for those advocates who are trying to, make a difference, who believe that this is something that is a major problem. They're completely missing the boat by not considering that. And it's I think tied to a longer history. I've read some historians of technology who've talked about how the sort of move away from colonialism kind of left a lot of this kind of knowledge out of the international development space and sort of is tied then to this sort of focus on data as being universalizable and focus on that. And so, so that's how I would answer it. I think that I wouldn't yet, I'm not sure I would be clear about what kind of policy or intervention would work, but I think that there are some clear questions that arise that could then easily be fed into interventions. As far as the disposable sanitary pads are concerned, I think it's a difficult issue now because if a girl wants access and is now getting access, I certainly don't want to be the one standing in that girl's way. But I think it raises then a set of questions for the providers, for the practitioners, and for policymakers around where are these disposable sanitary pads going to be actually disposed? What's going to happen? How do we make sure that there aren't these negative implications? And those kinds of things haven't been thought through. And in that way, it sort of fits into the model of all of this, a lot of the stuff that I've done before, which is that these are these consequences that could have been anticipated and yet weren't because it was kind of proposed as a simple solution. And this is something that we I think could think about pretty quickly. In terms of the market and innovation ideology, I do think that I think that that's important. It's very important. For me, and this is stuff that I've talked about previously, the market is deeply tied to the innovation ideology, and sort of why does Muruganathan become the focus? It is because he fits into certain kinds of ideologies around the market and ideologies around innovation that are tied to these ideologies around the market. But there are two caveats that I would put there. The first is that what's interesting to me, there's this book that I reference called The Gender Effect that just came out that talks about this, the focus on the girl is really about kind of the market. And I think that's right, but I think that misses a couple of things that I hope a science studies perspective can provide. And the first is that market perspective is also not just about the rise of social entrepreneurship or new ways of creating commodities. It's also embedded in the science as well, and the kinds of questions that get asked by the public health scientists, the MHM scientists. And the second thing, and this is where I haven't at all figured it out, but I'm really interested in, and it seems like there's something different happening, and this isn't the first time I've seen it, is that there's something interesting to me about the fact that some of this isn't about the market at all. It is about the fact that the priorities in science and engineering are for generalizable, scalable solutions. That's not about the market. That's about how the scientific method works, about the rise of statistics, about the kinds of things that get published in prestigious journals. That's about sort of discrete interventions and kind of universal solutions. So, it seems, so I don't know if it's that science and the market have parallel ideologies, where they tie together, what I can say about that. But I think that there's something there that I want to exploit a little bit further. But for sure, the attempt to commodify this space is, it's steeped all over the space. And in fact, and I've argued this in my previous work, so then you have this debate that's emerging, right? As I mentioned, this professor who published a book in the fall. So the debate that's now, to the extent the debate is emerging in India, the debate that's emerging is about product, not product, right? So that's still a debate that's constructed by the sort of pervasiveness of the market, right? So it's certainly there, but I think there are a couple of other pieces of it that I want to get at in more detail.
Okay. Can we maybe take 3 questions, because I know you're
Yeah.
tired, and we could collect them all at once and then have a collective answer. Is that okay, or am I cutting off a great discussion too soon?
My question, okay. My question actually is very much related to what was just been asked, so I'll keep it very short. I was curious, particularly about the role that the private industry plays in India, the particular producers of disposable pads, in the politics of knowledge production, in entry and exit, in innovation, etc. But also how the international market in disposable products as such plays, because it's a huge market if you think of all other sorts of disposable products, and how their sort of privileged position in terms of their economic power in advertising, and this linkage of hygiene to disposable products across, so many medical products, diapers, so many things we can think of, and how that aesthetics of hygiene just percolates internationally and, into India.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Should I answer that, or you want to take multiple questions?
Why don't we take all 3 and then?
Okay.
That's what I thought you said. It's on? Yeah. So I don't have any statistics to quote, but I think that the age of menarche has decreased for the last 4 generations. I think that's global because of better nutrition. So does that also imply that the age that girls are marriage eligible has decreased? That's my one question. The second question that I had was, is there an age in all parts of India that a girl must attend school until a certain age? And is that, if so, is that enforceable?
Mine's very simple. I wondered if in the literature anyone has dealt with Unani medicine. The reason I ask is because a very high percentage of these young coming doctors are in fact women, and they're in fact working in the rural countryside rather than in cities, and they might be an ideal group to do a real research to actually find answers, because they also speak the language.
Yeah, so in terms of, I'm still looking into it. I don't know. I do know that Ayurveda, there is some literature on Ayurveda. As I said, it's not integrated into this. But as I also said, it's not tied to the MHM conversation at all, to this MHM, the sort of MHM and development conversation at all. Yes, to my knowledge, also in India, the age of menarche is decreasing. I think that there are requirements about girls going to school, but India is not the easiest place to enforce policies like that. So yeah, that's a problem. In terms of the international market, I think that's a great question, and I want to think about it a little bit more. A couple of things that I'll say on that. So the first is that just on a kind of pragmatic, level. So Procter & Gamble, so the big Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark are the big producers of sanitary pads. I think Procter & Gamble is the biggest player in India. They make Whisper. A few years ago, they tried to address some of these issues. They had a campaign called Don't Touch the Pickle, which in this context means don't touch the, yeah, exactly. In this, I know, I too was like, but I do know, right? So here in this context, it means essentially the Indian chutney, South Indian. It's usually South Indian, but spicy. And the idea is that apparently in some communities, if women touch that, it's thought to spoil. And so, so the company tried to use that in a marketing campaign, and there was huge controversy about that. So that's a way in which they sort of kind of ham-handedly kind of tried to get into some of this stuff. But they also actually had, a number of years ago now, an attempt to try to get into this. So, our own C.K. Prahlad, right, has come up with, this whole idea around base of the market or base of the pyramid, and Procter & Gamble was essentially trying to do that, to say, okay, there are all of these girls who apparently don't use disposable sanitary pads, so how do we provide it? And that's actually where some of Muruganatham's fame came from, is that all of the international players decided that it wasn't worth it. It didn't make sense. From a profit perspective, from a business perspective, for them to be operating in that market. And so Muruganathan said, and it wasn't, as I said, it's not just Muruganathan. Actually, there were multiple people trying to make low-cost sanitary pads. But that's where the idea came from, is that in fact those companies decided that those were markets that they didn't want to enter at all. So this is where the kind of, the kind of permutation of the market ideology that's focused more on social innovation now, or grassroots innovation, plays a role in this. So that's the first thing. But from a broader perspective, I think your question, the sort of latter part of your question around sort of to what extent does the international market shape the rhetoric around this is an interesting and important one, because I think that is something that I heard quite a bit in my interviews. Not said in this way, but the kind of, what I took from that was that a lot of the rhetoric, especially around dignity and shame, and this concern about soiling, this sort of wearing white pants in an ad and saying that the means you use to manage your menstruation shouldn't soil the white pants, and right? I don't know. I don't wear white pants very frequently, but apparently we should all be endeavoring to wear tight white pants. So that what's interesting to me about that is that it is at the same time, I think, transporting certain ideas around shame and dignity and hygiene, as you suggested. And there's some, to the extent that that's acknowledged in the Indian context, what you hear is, I don't like using the word hygiene because it suggests that girls are impure, and there's already so much politics around purity in India and certain parts of India certainly, that I don't want to use that kind of terminology. But the sort of the idea that that they're working with international definitions or Western definitions of shame and dignity and hygiene, I think are not necessarily kind of, there's not reflection on that, I think, among the folks in India. And they're often, both explicitly and implicitly, right? Rhetorically, they're part of an international group of people working on this issue. Sometimes they have no explicit connection, but often they're funded by international NGOs. But they don't have to be funded by international NGOs in order to be shaped by the rhetoric in that MHM space, which is very, I think, sort of tied towards these Western notions of shame and dignity and hygiene.
Please help me thank Shobita.
Thank you very much.